All right, Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, with the new COVID-19 variants causing a surge in cases across the U.S., public school teachers in Chicago, Illinois, have indicated they will push to return to remote work. Despite how frustrating virtual learning has been for many parents and kids, the Chicago Teachers Union is also prepared to order a strike. The union polled its members on whether they would support going on strike against in-person work when school is slated to resume in January. Some 89% agreed to do so. At a virtual meeting on Tuesday, 91% of union members were in favor of the remote work action. Quote, if Chicago schools doesn't call for a period of remote instruction following winter break, are you prepared to participate in a remote work action as soon as we can organize a vote? Asked the two polls. With case counts rising rapidly, it's understandable for teachers to be concerned. Even so, moving back to virtual school would be an unmitigated disaster, a wholesale betrayal of working families, which is why both President Joe Biden and his Education Secretary Michael Cardona have maintained that schools should remain open despite the Omicron wave. The cost of closing schools is extremely high. Many young people languish in virtual learning environments and fail to learn much of anything at all. It's clear that Zoom education has contributed to significant learning losses in reading and math scores, particularly among minority and low-income kids. They just don't absorb very much information when they have to sit in front of their screens all day, if they show up at all. Moreover, the burden of watching virtual learners falls on parents, many of whom have professional obligations of their own. Physical schools serve as a vital daycare function so that parents can work without arranging for babysitters each and every day. Many working people do not have the resources or the flexibility to manage at-home kids. They are still expected to show up to work, pandemic or no pandemic. The same should be true of the teachers. K-12 education is funded through tax dollars, and families deserve the full benefits of the compulsory public service. Last year, Chicago Teachers Union fought tooth and nail to keep schools closed as long as possible. The union even tweeted that the drive to reopen schools was, quote, rooted in sexism and racism. If anything, the drive to keep schools closed was rooted in sexism and racism. Pandemic-related closures have disproportionately affected inner-city families that rely on public education, young kids of color, some of the hardest hit. And more than 800,000 women dropped out of the workforce during the pandemic. It's probably more than that. That was a figure from a long time ago, in large part because they now have to take care of their kids. It's not at all wrong for families to expect their kids' teachers to do their jobs. It's not sexist. It's not racist. It's the bare minimum requirement that all adults face. I understand that a lot of people are scared right now, given that case counts are so high. But today, we have something we didn't have a year ago. We have widespread vaccination. The vaccines are not stopping the spread, but they do stop severe disease and death. They provide very robust protection. So given that, the evidence is clear that schools can and should remain open, and that in-person instruction can continue with minimal safety risks. Teachers unions that keep struggling against the urgent need to give kids the educational experience they need, they are only undermining their own credibility. Indeed, it's obvious that frustration with teachers' unions and the public schools they control has generated a massive backlash. Voters in Virginia rejected Democratic gubernatorial candidate Terry McAuliffe in large part because he downplayed the role that parents should play in their kids' education. Remember this?
So first of all, this shows how clueless Glenn Youngkin is. He doesn't understand what the laws were because he's never been involved here in helping Virginia. But it was not. The parents had to write to veto books, Glenn, not to be knowledgeable about it, also take them off the shelves. And I'm not going to let parents come into schools and actually take books out and make their own decision.
You vetoed it.
So, yeah, I stopped the bill that I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach.
Oh, really? Well, a great many parents were angry at the idea that they didn't have a right to provide input to schools about what they were teaching, and yet parents were expected to shoulder the entire burden of education whenever their teachers decided they didn't feel like showing up to work anymore. That was a losing message, and McAuliffe went down to defeat. What the teachers' unions are doing makes no political sense. They won't get away with this, and they shouldn't. As I've said repeatedly, the new variants of COVID-19 have proven to be incredibly contagious. Remains the case, despite that, the vaccines offer incredible defense against severe disease and death. The Omicron variant also appears to cause milder disease in general, as far as we can tell. Teachers who get vaccinated enjoy tremendous protection from bad COVID outcomes, and they belong in the classroom alongside their students, who are also protected from COVID. Even if they're not vaccinated, because of their status as young people. Very few young people have severe negative COVID outcomes unless they have prior health issues. That's all the reason we need to keep classrooms open. Our public school teachers, they are essential workers, so they should act like it. So what do you think, Kim? I know you're a supporter of the labor movement and of unions and workers striking for their rights, for better treatment and all that. Fine, but these are in some sense they're government employees. They're funded by our tax dollars, and they have tried to assert a kind of condition, the kind of, well, we're just not going to show up to work, that like no one else has done, even though their work situation is like the safest of all in-person work situations because the kids are just not that vulnerable to COVID. So it doesn't make any sense. But they're the most liable to close, to shut down, to follow militant masking and everything else. They have all sorts of mandates. They have vaccine mandates. And it's where it makes the least sense, and it's yet where they have the most power to just totally shut the thing down.
Yeah, I agree with you that they are absolutely essential workers and should act like it. They're going to the grocery stores, they're getting they're doing all of these other things in order to survive and live life. And yet when it comes to children and education, the one thing about this pandemic, children just seem to have been the ones that have had to sacrifice the absolute most during this pandemic for their development, for their social skills, their mental health, education. And people, because they're voiceless, children are voiceless. Look, I'm all about unions, labor unions, as you mentioned, and I do believe that these teachers have the right to get together and all demand whatever it is they want to demand. I just think their demands are totally unreasonable. And I think that it completely overlooks the voiceless, which are the children who don't get a say at all in any of this. And some of us need to stand up for those kids and say, look, this is unnatural. It's unnatural to ask children to sacrifice for older people. We know who the most at risk are for COVID outcomes. That has not changed during the 2 years of this pandemic. It's the older people of retirement age, typically, people over retirement who are probably not even teaching anymore. Now, I know a lot of people live with their older parents or grandparents or whatever, and so people need to take some extra precautions there. But as you mentioned, now we have vaccines. You take a vaccine, you're less likely to have a negative outcome. So you're protected as a teacher. You're protected, your loved one at home. Maybe your elderly loved one is protected. You can still wear masks as a teacher if you feel like it, and a face shield. Do whatever you feel like you need to do. But those children need an education. And in some countries, like in Germany, for example, education is considered a right. It's an absolute right. And they don't believe that you can decide on shutting children out of an education. Now, kids going to remote learning, they'll say, well, they're still getting the education. They're going to remote learning. We know from what we've seen that remote learning is not working for a lot of kids. And I want to mention this in my radar yesterday. I got some heat from people because I mentioned, parents being forced to homeschool their children and how that results often in a lower quality education. And I don't mean that for parents who choose to homeschool, who actively homeschool their children. I'm talking about the parents that are forced into homeschooling. They're not prepared to homeschool. Maybe they don't even speak English. They can't do it. And they're being forced into it for whatever reason, and then their children end up with a lower quality education, which is what I meant by that. And now you're going to look, a lot of these kids, their parents are blue collar workers. They have to go into work. What are they going to do with their kid? They've got one iPad at home maybe, and they've got 3 kids. Like, what are they doing? So
for a long and indefinite period of time, and it was unplanned. It wasn't like, the government said, look, this situation is really bad. Things are just not going to be open for the next 4 months. So you're going to have to take care of your kids. And that's just the way it has to be. Right. That has stretched into 2 years. Can you imagine having missed 2 years of high school?
No.
Or your 7th and 8th grade? That would be a really horrible experience for a young person. That would put you behind if sports matter a lot to you, or extracurricular activities, or anything. If any part of school matters to you, matters to a lot of kids, just if it's your social circle. So it was a big ask, and we have asked it, and some of the people involved in policy and education are continuing to ask it, and it's just quite ridiculous, and it is beyond unreasonable. So anyway, Team Rising will join us next to discuss more subjects, subjects other than COVID. So if you've been waiting for that, it's coming up.
Yeah, Ghislaine Maxwell, which is a big one. We're going to be talking about that, I think, next. That's
right. Stay with us.
Yeah.